Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. This is a response to a video that the Distributist did, which was about optimism, as presented in a video by Zarathustra's snake. Now, they're just sort of two things. I recommend the video a lot, by the way. In general, I tend to like all of the Distributist stuff, and it's all worth watching. So I'll send you to that for much of the context. Just suffice it to say that the discussion was about whether or not classical liberalism will triumph or be defeated in the modern world. And with skeptics, TM, being on the side of the classical liberalism. And Zarathustra's snake was taking the position that it will win, so it should be optimistic because essentially the march of history is inevitable. Now, the Distributist was taking the perspective that the march of history is not inevitable. And in that he is correct, of course. But there are 2 points that I think he misses. One of which is that the video is called Self-Flattering False History is Not Going to Win Anything. And another name for self-flattering false history is foundation myths. Now, foundation myths, like the foundation myths of the United States, for example, with George Washington chopping down his cherry tree, and things of that sort of nature. Foundation myths do not need to be true to be inspiring. This is a point I think the Distributist does know, although why he didn't apply it here, I'm not sure. But it doesn't really matter whether or not your foundation myth is literally true, so long as it embodies the ideal for which you will be willing to fight and die. It can be actually very useful, and because, as the Distributist well knows, the human mind tends to function primarily in a narrative way. It tends to understand things best in a narrative sort of structure. A foundation myth, a false history, doesn't need to be true in the least in order to actually have the practical value of rallying people to be willing to fight against hopeless odds that they may, one day eventually be fighting against hopeful odds or, even triumph. So there's that as the background. The basic premise there is flawed because, to a great degree, I think what Zarathustra is doing is, in fact, proposing a foundation myth. The second thing, that's to say, he's proposing a foundation myth precisely to give people the optimism they don't have now, not because, in fact, they should just assume everything's going to be fine, because, well, then it doesn't matter. You might as well be depressed as hell if you think everything's going to turn out all right anyway. The only, practical value to being optimistic is being willing to still fight in the face of odds. And therefore the spinning of the foundation myth that tells, that reinforces this idea that your cause is not hopeless and there is some reason to continue, actually has a practical value, but only insofar as you buy into it rather than, it being true. Okay, that aside, the other thing that I think the Distributist sort of misses is that he's really taking this idea that the skeptics, trademark, are fighting for classical liberalism too literally. They're not fighting for classical liberalism. Not the sort of classical liberalism you had in essentially the fresh corpse of Christendom. I'm going a little bit far by calling Christendom a corpse, but that said, I think most people will know what I mean. That classical liberalism was the attempt to have Christianity without the supernatural elements. And that was at a time when the supernatural elements were still widely accepted and widely, brought life to the West. But not all the West, and hence the, the attempt to have this, but still very much in that context where people did things like wanted virtue and so on. This was before the belief in undirected evolution. Now, the thing about undirected evolution, let me emphasize that undirected, as opposed to what Catholics like the Distributist and I, at least I presume he believes in, is directed evolution, which is a very different thing, where evolution is a tool used by God to produce results. And undirected evolution, by contrast, is this blind process that has no goals of any kind, that just sort of stumbles into things existing because that happens to work out towards them existing. That theory that whatever there's more of, there tends to be more of that sort of thing. That theory results in something that is entirely hostile to the concept of natures. There isn't really such thing as a human nature. And what's worse is it's entirely hostile to the concept of virtue. In more technical terms, it's not that it is ateleological, but rather anti-teleological. That all of your capacity for happiness, enjoyment, and so on is all basically, a carrot dangled in front of you to try to get you to make more descendants. And it's not actually that, because that's imputing a directedness to it. It's rather that this happened to be a carrot that your ancestors ambled towards and happened to make you, and you happen to be like them. So whatever kind of got them to do it is now the way you yourself amble on. The consequence of which is that all enjoyment, pleasure, and so on serves a purpose, metaphorically speaking, that has nothing whatever to do with your ultimate happiness. And in fact, happiness in the long term is antithetical towards using carrots. The carrot has to be on the end of a stick, not feeding to the horse, because at some point, if you actually let the horse eat the carrot, the horse gets full and stops wanting to move. It stops pulling the cart. Consequently, the best way to maximize pleasure is to cheat the system. It's to actually get at the carrot. From the horse's perspective, the best way to actually get that thing as you're going is to stop and move backwards and then stop again. And then the carrot's going to swing towards your mouth and you can actually bite the carrot. I'm using that intentionally. It's the idea of anti-teleology. Hence things like the sexual revolution, in which you attempt to defang sex from all of the responsibilities involved so that you can have the pleasure without the responsibilities. The same thing goes with the consumerist culture that in general was talked about in the video. That this consumerist culture is all stimulating your pleasure without having any content. Because of course the content for which you have pleasure within a system of undirected evolution is something like producing, descendants, and that's not itself pleasurable or fun or anything like that. That's simply the goal, and your pleasure sort of minimized because if it's minimized, then you'll get it, but you'll need to do the thing that makes the descendants again and again and again and again, and that's the way you get the maximization. So mindless consumption is actually the theoretical ideal within a system of undirected evolution, because your pleasure has been sort of minimized, and so you've got to cheat everything. You've got to remove the substance, specifically because when the substance is gone, then you can have more of the pleasure. The substance actually sort of inhibiting the pleasure. So within that context, what you have that is like classical liberalism is the desire to, it's basically a hedonism, the desire to maximize that sort of thing. That freedom within this system basically consists in the ability to be a slave to your passions, except with the technical prowess to keep your passions from overmastering you. Because within the classical world, the problem with being a slave to your passions is that you'd have all sorts of problems. If you were gluttonous, then you get fat. If you're, if you have sex, then you have descendants. And also people who are angry at you for how you treat their descendants, because people can't, we're not an asexual species. And so there's multiple ancestors to any given descendant. All sorts of problems like this. You can carry it through. And so in the modern world, the thing about technology is that it gives us the ability to divorce consequences from actions, so that we can indulge in that hedonism without the terrible, results. Hence things like the non-nutritive sweeteners, the fake fats, and so on, so that we can have all the pleasure of eating without any of the pain of being full. Or rather, of getting fat afterwards. In theory, it doesn't actually work in practice, obviously, but that's the theory, and that's why this is always accompanied by technological triumphalism, that one day technology will remove all consequences from actions, and so we can do nothing but pure empty puffery, and therefore will suffer nothing. And no, this is exactly what the Distributist is railing against, a mindless empty hedonism. Now, here's the thing, though, because the goal is to be a slave to your passions as much as possible, but without any of the consequences that naturally would occur through technological intervention. The Distributist rightly points out that this sort of mindless consumerism, which is, just hedonism in its process of being accomplished, is entirely compatible with, dictatorship, roughly speaking, authoritarianism is the term he uses, and it is. But there's only authoritarianism on offer within a system of undirected evolution because it is, after all, not like you picked the things that make you happy. The things that make you happy were thrust upon you. You have no freedom to choose those. And so, in satisfying them, it doesn't really matter. The general approach that people tend to take within this is that it really doesn't matter all that much if you are constrained in the areas that don't bring you happiness anyway. All that really matters is your access to the things that bring you pleasure. So as long as the authoritarian system is not getting in the way of your pleasure, it is therefore an entirely reasonable trade-off to getting access at that pleasure. And you can see this, in fact, in one of the classic enemies. The classic enemies of the skeptic trademark community, the social justice warrior Marxists. Marxism is, of course, insanely authoritarian. And yet, if you actually look at what Marxists say, they talk about this being freedom, not because they think that it is, a complete lack of restraint, because no such thing exists, but rather because its constraints and its lack of constraints match up to what they want. And it is pretty noticeable that in general, there are a bunch of asterisks on this, but hopefully you can supply them for brevity's sake. In general, what they want is a government that will tell you how to do everything except what to do with your genitals. Some of the asterisks being about consent and interactions and, these days pronouns and so on. But that aside, that what they want is the ability to do whatever they want with their genitals without repercussions, and heavy repercussions for everything else, and strict authority on everything else that enables the maximization of this genital freedom involved. And so you can take that as essentially, I'd say a microcosm, except Marxism is pretty popular, but nonetheless symbolic of the general approach that what you want is not freedom in the absolute sense, because, if nothing else, there are laws of physics that constrain you. You'll never be perfectly free. But rather a system that matches up where your constraints are on the things that you don't mind not doing anyhow, and your freedoms are on the things that you definitely want to do. Now, how does this tie into the hedonism thing, or how does this tie into Zarathustra's idea that this march of progress is inevitable towards freedom in this sense? Well, it's that technology, as technology spreads, enables this consumerism, which is the divorce of actions from consequences. It is the separation, of the natural relationship of things, such that you can have this hedonism without any of the consequences, because I think there is some understanding, to some degree, that the previous systems of not being free, like medieval serfs and so on, was in part based on their physical conditions. They didn't have the modern technology, which enabled them to have the pleasures without the pains, and therefore there was, some system of constraint necessary to keep them from many of the pleasures, because too many of the pains would follow. Not that they really thought this through, but I think on some level they do understand that. But the thing is, all those systems, all the ancient religions which were meant to keep people from hurting themselves too badly, will be thrown off in the face of modern technology, which divorces all of that, in that there's no restraint necessary any further, because technology has removed all the negative consequences to a complete lack of restraint. If anyone's seen the movie WALL-E, the humans several hundred years from now are these, fat, almost formless lumps sitting on chairs that move around for them and hand them their drinks and so on, as they sit there not doing anything. And yet, these people are actually rather happy. It's, within the movie it's shown to be a fake sort of happiness, but nonetheless, those people, those formless blobs moving around on chairs, is just about the modern hedonistic ideal, because technology has in fact divorced them from everything. Even, granted, they're not thin because the fake food hasn't worked perfectly well, because, well, it is sort of a morality play. But, in a real, utopian version by the modern atheist standard, they would all be, thin and beautiful rather than fat and ugly. But that's a fat and ugly, by the way, because they're also misshapen in other ways too. Not saying fat is necessarily ugly, though. It is the case that nobody believes that fat is the ideal. There's essentially nobody who wants to be fat. Anyway, the point being that system is actually basically as good as it gets. That that the technology has utterly divorced them from all the consequences, so they could enjoy nothing but unending pleasure, and that's about the most that could happen in that undirected evolution sense. And the thing is, what they're basically banking on, what Zarathustra's serpent is banking on, is that when exposed to all of this technology which divorces pleasure from its consequences, people will notice over time that when you indulge using this technology, none of the consequences happen. And therefore, the pleasure is harmless, and all the systems of restraint that had been meant to keep you from, protect you from the harms attendant to these pleasures are now antiquated and pointless because there are no harms attendant to these pleasures anymore. And so once people see this, and it can take decades for people to really see, well, nothing terrible actually happened when I, had all that casual sex, because, I didn't have any children, so things are still pretty much fine, etc. That those things are, will eventually be noticed, and people will eventually realize that there's no purpose to any of these restraints they've been placing on themselves. That all of these virtues have no end anymore because technology has eliminated all of the downsides to the pleasures. Now, it's an ugly, ugly future in which people just sit there being pleased and doing nothing, turning into shapeless blobs that are stimulated without contributing, without, the ability even to walk, just sitting there doing nothing but being stimulated. It's if you really, really take it to its apex, you get the Matrix. That sort of, if you really push it, you get the Matrix. Except in order to have, it's a plot, the Matrix had the premise that people didn't like that and eventually rejected the pure pleasure world. But there's that scene where Agent Smith explains that the first Matrix was nothing but unending happiness. And if you stop right there and don't conclude that, people will fight and get into wars because they wouldn't accept it, that's basically the ideal. These inert bodies that are simply being pleasured constantly. And nothing could be better than that within undirected evolution. Because all you've got is what you happen to like. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.